I am the emperor of the most powerful empire on the continent. I have stood in front of hostile courts and said no without blinking. I have fixed irrigation channels in my formal robes. I cannot explain why this man, this foreign alpha emperor who arrived 2 days early and brought fruit, is the reason I cannot sleep. I told myself I had it under control, and then I walked into him in a dark corridor at midnight, and my Omega instincts, which I have been carefully ignoring for years, took one look at him and decided, no, no more redirecting. We are done. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Alphas always notice. He went completely still. And then, and this is the part I cannot stop thinking about, he asked me. He actually asked, "Tell me if you need me to step back." Nobody has ever asked me that. 200 years of Omega Emperors, 6 portraits in a hall of stone, and not one of us was ever just asked. I said, "Don't step back. I don't know what I'm doing. I know what I'm building. I just didn't expect it to look like this."
Welcome to the Portal Library. Step through and let the magic begin. Make sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you love more stories or have a request. New videos uploaded every Friday. The Weight of Jade, a sequel to the Omega who conquered an empire.
Chapter 1. The Emperor Who Visits Farms. Xol, province of Tlavik, Eastern Highlands. The mud was the consistency of river clay and the color of bad decisions. And Emperor Xol-Itzan of the Varak Empire had been elbow deep in it for the better part of 2 hours. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in the capital, reviewing trade proposals and sitting for portrait sessions, and doing approximately 40 other things his chancellor had color-coded on a clay tablet. Chancellor Oren had been very specific about the color coding. Red meant urgent, black meant ceremonial. There was an entire column in deep crimson. Saul had looked at the tablet, packed a travel satchel, and left before dawn. He told himself it was a governance tour. He told his guards it was an unannounced inspection. He told the farmers of Tlavik, who had found him standing in their northern irrigation canal, trying to figure out why the eastern channel kept flooding, that he was just passing through. They had not believed him. They also had not asked him to leave, which he counted as a victory. "The blockage is about 3 body lengths down from the fork," said the older farmer beside him, a woman named Sitla, who had introduced herself by handing him a shovel. "We've been trying to clear it for 2 seasons. The silt keeps coming back." "It's compacting wrong," Saul said, prodding the channel wall. He was soaked to the knee, his formal sash abandoned on the riverbank. "The angle of the secondary channel is pulling sediment instead of pushing it. You need to widen the mouth by about half a handspan and angle it." He stopped. Sitla was staring at him with an expression that fell somewhere between bemused and alarmed. "You're the emperor," she said. "Yes. Standing in my irrigation ditch." "Also yes. Showing me how to fix my irrigation ditch." "That's the hope." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the ditch. Then she looked back at him. "My grandmother used to say that Ikton walked with the people," she said finally. "She said that was why they followed him." The name landed the way it always did, a small weight in Saul's chest, familiar and complicated. "My grandmother," he said carefully, "said Ikton once executed 3 nobles before breakfast and still made it to a trade hearing by mid-morning." "Both can be true," Sitla said. Saul had no answer for that. He handed her back the shovel. They worked in companionable silence for another hour. His guards stood at a respectful distance, pretending not to exist. The farmers of Tlavik pretended, with increasing difficulty, that they were not stealing glances at their emperor's mud-covered sandals. By the time the channel was cleared and the water running smoothly again, the sun had begun its westward lean. And a messenger in palace colors was picking his way down the hillside path with the expression of a man who had been looking for someone for a very long time. Saul saw him coming. He took one last moment to watch the water move, clean and purposeful now, doing what it was supposed to do, and felt the brief, uncomplicated satisfaction of a problem actually solved. Then the messenger reached him, bowed deeply, and handed over a sealed clay tablet. Saul broke the seal, read the message, read it again. "The Zafari delegation has arrived. Emperor Darian Korash of the Zafar Concordat requests an audience at earliest convenience. He arrived 2 days early. The Chancellor requests, with great urgency, your immediate return to the capital. The Chancellor also wishes you to know he is using the word immediate in its fullest possible sense." Saul looked up at the hillside, then down at his mud-caked legs, then at the messenger, who was very determinedly not reacting to any of this. "How fast is my fastest horse?" Saul asked. "Very fast, Your Radiance." "Good." The imperial capital, Varek. The palace was larger than Darian had expected. He had studied it. Of course he had studied it. He had spent 6 months preparing for this diplomatic mission with the methodical thoroughness that his advisors called admirable and his court poet called, less charitably, obsessive. He had read every account of the Varek Empire available in the Zafar Concordat's archives. He had commissioned new translations of Iktan's coronation address. He had requested maps, trade records, population surveys, architectural drawings. None of it had quite captured the scale. The palace rose in great jade-inlaid terraces up the face of a natural hillside, each level connected by processional staircases wide enough to march an army up. Stone carved with centuries of history. Towers that caught the late afternoon light and scattered it in colors he didn't have names for. Gardens that cascaded down the lower slopes like something from a story told to children. His senior advisor, Farouk, appeared at his elbow with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been appearing at elbows for 30 years. "Your Imperial Highness," Farouk murmured. "The welcoming ceremony is scheduled for the 3rd hour." "Is the Emperor here yet?" Darian asked. Farouk's pause was very brief and very telling. "The Emperor," Farouk said, with the careful intonation of a man choosing his words like stepping stones across deep water, "is en route." En route from the Eastern Highlands. He was conducting a governance tour. "He left the capital," Darian said, "knowing we were arriving." 2 days early, Farouk said gently. "We did arrive 2 days early." That was fair. Darian had pushed the timeline, his navigator had found favorable winds, and he'd made the call. Still, somewhere in there, a very flustered chancellor was almost certainly rewriting ceremony schedules with increasingly frantic energy. To his considerable surprise, Darian felt his mouth curve. "What does one do," he asked, "when one arrives early to meet an emperor who is gone to look at farming?" "Typically," Farouk said, with the air of a man who had given up pretending this was a normal diplomatic situation, "one waits. Then we wait." He was shown to his suite. 3 connected rooms that could have swallowed his entire private quarters back home, furnished with obsidian and jade and woven textiles in colors so vivid they seemed to hum. His attendants were very polite. The palace staff moved with the practiced ease of people used to hosting dignitaries from across the known world. On the wall above the writing table hung a small portrait. Not a large one, not the formal, monumental kind he'd seen at the palace gates, where Iktan Varek stared down at visitors with the expression of a man who had once set fire to a noble's house and felt completely justified about it. This was smaller, intimate, a study portrait, the kind kept in private rooms. Iktan in the portrait was younger than in the official images, mid-20s perhaps. He was not looking at the painter, he was looking at something outside the frame, his expression caught in an unguarded moment. Not the Iron Emperor of legend, but someone sharp and tired and quietly, stubbornly hopeful. Darian stood in front of it for a long time. He had read everything written about this man, the histories, the hagiographies, the critical accounts from foreign scholars who found the whole Omega Emperor phenomenon deeply uncomfortable. The personal accounts from people who had known him. What struck him most, always, was not the conquest, not the political maneuvering, not the assassinations, not the coup that had reshaped an empire. It was the epilogue, the 5 years of messy, imperfect, exhausting reform, the council half filled with elected representatives. The child named Taya, raised openly as heir. The line at the end of every serious account. He was trying. That, Darian thought, was the real legacy, not the fire, the trying. He was still thinking about it when his attendant knocked to inform him that Emperor Xol-Itzan had returned to the capital and would receive the Zafari delegation at the 1st hour tomorrow morning. And also, the attendant delivered this with the careful neutrality of someone relaying information they found personally bewildering, that the emperor sent his apologies for any inconvenience and had left a basket of highland fruit from the province he just visited as a gesture of welcome. Darian looked at the basket, then at the portrait, then he sat down at the writing table and laughed, quietly, to himself, the way he only did when no one was watching. Because somehow, from everything he had read and prepared for, this was not what he had expected the Varek Empire to be. He had changed into formal robes. He had allowed his attendants to do whatever they needed to do with his hair, which had suffered considerably during the Highlands trip. He had reviewed the diplomatic briefings Chancellor Oren had prepared,
All 14 pages of them, including the section helpfully titled, Things Not to Say to a Zafari Emperor. He was, by any reasonable measure, prepared.
He was not prepared for Darian Korash to be approximately his age. He didn't know why he hadn't absorbed this from the briefings. The information was there. 29 years old, ascended to the Zafari throne at 24 after his father's illness, ruled for 5 years, with a reputation for patience and an unsettling ability to sit silently in negotiations until the other party collapsed under the pressure of their own discomfort. Xol had read all of this. He had still somehow expected someone older, more severe, more like the formal Zafari portraits he'd seen, all dark brows and gravity, and the particular expression of men who had been told, since birth, that they were very important. Emperor Darian Korash of the Zafar Concordat walked into the Varak throne room in formal traveling robes of deep blue and gold, his dark hair pulled back, and looked around at the jade-inlaid ceiling and the obsidian throne and the assembled court with the open, attentive expression of someone who had never in his life successfully pretended to be unimpressed by something impressive. His gaze landed on Xol. Something in his expression shifted. Not displeasure, more like recalibration, as if he had also been expecting someone slightly different. The court went through its formal movements. The herald announced. The chancellor presented. There were ritual greetings in both imperial tongues, which Darian delivered with a slight Zafari accent, but impeccable pronunciation, which meant he had practiced. The exchange of formal gifts, the acknowledgement of the alliance proposal that had brought them here. All of it correct, all of it proper. And then the formalities ended, and there was a moment, brief, suspended, where it was simply two emperors in a room, looking at each other. Your Radiance, Darian said, in the common trade tongue they defaulted to during the informal portion of the greeting. Thank you for receiving me. Your Imperial Highness, Xol said. Thank you for he paused. The patience. I understand you arrived early. The winds were favorable. I was in a ditch, Xol said. There was a small silence. I heard, Darian said. Irrigation channel, technically. Of course. Darian's expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had. A warmth that hadn't been there in the formal portion, tentative and a little surprised, like a fire that wasn't sure yet if the wood was going to catch. The Highland citrus was excellent. The eastern province grows the best in the empire, Xol said, and heard himself say it with the particular earnestness of someone who had just spent 2 days in a place and developed strong feelings about its agricultural output. He became aware, with creeping discomfort, that Chancellor Oren was staring at him from across the room, with an expression of long-suffering professional despair. I can. There's a trade angle there, actually. If your climate is... I'd be interested to hear it, Darian said. He said it simply. No performance, no diplomatic smoothing, just genuinely, apparently interested. Xol had spent his entire reign bracing for the moment when people's patience with his particular way of ruling ran out. When someone important, someone whose opinion mattered, would look at him the way parts of his court looked at him, with the polite, exhausted tolerance of people waiting for him to become the emperor the history books said he should be. Darian Korash looked at him with something else entirely. Xol did not know what to do with that. He filed it away as a problem to think about later, and got through the rest of the afternoon's schedule, on the sheer momentum of diplomatic training. XOL. Later that evening. The portrait of Iktan in Xol's private study was large. It had always been large, painted in the years just after the coronation, when the new emperor had still had the particular look of someone who had survived something enormous, and was only beginning to understand what they'd built. It dominated the east wall. Xol sat in the chair across from it, as he did sometimes when the court was quiet, and he had run out of productive things to worry about. The portrait looked back with those dark, guarded eyes that every painter seemed to find irresistible. The obsidian bracelet on his wrist, the tunic in deep blue, the expression that said, very clearly, I know exactly what I'm doing, even when that was probably not entirely true. He arrived early, Xol told the portrait, to meet with me, and I was in a ditch. The portrait offered no opinion. He didn't seem bothered by it, Xol continued. He seemed interested. This was the thing he kept returning to, sitting alone in his study, with the lamps burning low, and the sounds of the night city drifting up from below. Not the formal audience, not the complex political calculus of what this alliance would mean, the careful balancing act of two courts with different histories and different fears. Not the 14 pages of diplomatic briefing, just that moment. The brief recalibration in Darian's expression when he'd seen Xol for the first time. The warmth that had appeared unplanned, when Xol had said something honest by accident.
His court looked at him with varying degrees of loyalty, exasperation, and carefully managed expectation. Foreign dignitaries looked at him with the particular diplomacy of people who knew they were looking at a very powerful empire and needed to be polite about it. Common people, the farmers and merchants and laborers he sought out whenever he could escape his own schedule, looked at him with something warmer, genuine affection, often, which he treasured, but also a kind of wonder that kept a distance. Darian Korash had looked at him like he was a person worth figuring out. Xol pulled his knees to his chest, which was undignified and comfortable, and something he only did when no one was watching. His Omega instincts had been in the past few years a problem he managed through sheer application of busyness. The drive for contact, for warmth, for the particular settling calm of a presence that fit against his. He had learned to redirect it into work, into visits to distant provinces, into the 18-hour days that had made him genuinely popular and quietly exhausted. He had been very good at redirecting it. This afternoon in the throne room, it had noticed something, and then proceeded to refuse to be redirected. This was inconvenient. He looked at the portrait one more time. "I don't suppose," he said, "you have any useful advice about this." The portrait said nothing. It was, as always, impeccably unhelpful. Xol set down his lamp, pulled his formal robe tighter against the night air, and went to bed.
Chapter 2. The Portrait and the Question. Darian, morning, third day. Farouk had opinions. This was not unusual. Farouk had been having opinions since before Darian could walk, had served 3 generations of Karash emperors with the particular brand of loyalty that expressed itself primarily through organized, well-documented disagreement. Darian had inherited him along with the throne and had long since learned to treat his displeasure as a kind of early warning system. Right now, Farouk's displeasure was arranged neatly in 2 clay tablets on the breakfast table. "The council sent formal inquiries last night," Farouk said, standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back. This was his serious posture. He had several postures. Darian had catalogued them over 29 years. Lord Savan and Minister Sarath jointly. They want to know when the formal negotiation sessions will begin.
"We've been here 3 days, Darian said, breaking a piece of flatbread. "They are aware of that. The preliminary discussions aren't finished. They are also aware of that. Their concern," Farouk said, with a careful neutrality that meant he was about to relay something he personally found irritating, "is that the preliminary discussions appear to involve a great deal of time spent in informal company with the Varick Emperor, and very little time spent in formal negotiation with the Varick Council." Darian set down his flatbread. "We had one informal meeting," he said, "yesterday, for 2 hours, about citrus. And irrigation infrastructure," Farouk added. "Lord Savan has noted that irrigation infrastructure is not part of the proposed alliance terms." "Lord Savan," Darian said, "has never had to grow anything in his life." Farouk did not respond to this. He was very good at not responding to things. The truth was that Lord Savan and Minister Sarath represented a faction of the Safari court that had not, if Darian was being precise about it, fully endorsed this diplomatic mission in the first place. They had endorsed the concept of an alliance with the Varick Empire, the trade routes, the military deterrence, the agricultural knowledge that could help the Concordat's drought-stricken southern provinces. That part they understood. What they had not endorsed, and continued not to endorse with increasing vocal energy, was what they called excessive deference to a smaller empire's customs. What they meant, translated from the diplomatic language they used in formal correspondence, was that they did not particularly want their emperor spending his mornings in amicable conversation with an Omega who happened to also be one of the most powerful rulers on the continent. They found it, in a word Darian had heard used in whispers, undignified. Darian picked his flatbread back up. "Tell Lord Savan that the formal negotiation sessions will begin when I determine the groundwork has been adequately laid. Tell him also that I am aware of the timeline and do not require reminding. And Minister Sarath? Tell her the same thing with slightly warmer phrasing." Farouk inclined his head. He picked up both tablets, tucked them under his arm, and moved toward the door with the smooth efficiency of a man who had delivered worse news and survived. At the door, he paused. "For what it is worth," he said, without turning around, "I do not personally share Lord Savan's concerns about the manner of these discussions." Darian looked up. "The Varick Emperor," Farouk continued, still addressing the doorframe, "is not what I expected. I find that relevant to note." Then he left. Darian sat for a moment with his flatbread and thought about that. Not what I expected. No, that was the thing, wasn't it? That was the thing he kept turning over in the back of his mind, like a stone that kept catching the light differently, depending on how he held it. He had come here with a clear picture of what the Varick Empire would be. Ancient, formidable, proud in the particular way of powers that have never had to question their own dominance. He had expected elegance with teeth underneath. He had expected to spend 3 weeks in careful, exhausting negotiation with people who were entirely aware that they held most of the advantages and intended to use them. He had not expected Emperor Xol-Itzan to know the angle at which silt compacts in an irrigation channel. He had not expected the fruit basket. He had not expected, and this was the part he kept returning to, the part he could not quite categorize and file away. The look on Sol's face when Darian had said, "I'd be interested to hear it." That brief, unguarded flicker, like something had been offered that he hadn't known how to ask for. Darian was good at reading people. It was, his advisor said, his most useful political skill. He could sit across a negotiating table and know within 10 minutes which arguments would land and which would be deflected, what a person actually feared versus what they were pretending to fear, where the real line was. He was reading Emperor Xol-Itzan and getting something he didn't entirely know what to do with. Someone who was genuinely, deeply good at caring for people, and completely uncertain that this counted for anything at all. He finished his breakfast. He had a meeting with the Varick Chancellor in an hour, and after that, he had arranged it carefully, framed it as cultural exchange, which it was, technically, a tour of the Imperial Memorial Hall, the portraits of the Omega Emperors. He was looking forward to it with an interest that was only partly scholarly, and he was not going to examine that too closely. The Imperial Memorial Hall. The Memorial Hall was not usually on the diplomatic tour. It wasn't hidden or restricted. Anyone could walk in. It was a public space, open to citizens twice a week on visiting days. But foreign delegations were typically shown the throne room, the council chamber, the ceremonial gardens, the market district. Things that communicated power and prosperity. Things that said, "Look at what we have built." The Memorial Hall communicated something different. It was long and vaulted, lit from above by a continuous row of stone-framed openings in the roof that tracked the sun's movement and filled the space with shifting, living light. The floor was polished dark stone. The walls held portraits, not military victories, not territorial maps, not the usual visual grammar of empire. Just faces. Each Omega Emperor, from Icton forward, rendered in the same format. 3/4 view, plain background, eyes that looked somewhere beyond the frame. Xol walked slowly, as he always did here. Darian walked beside him. His attendants had suggested a more comprehensive tour. Xol had overruled them. He hadn't quite examined why. It had something to do with the way Darian had looked at the small portrait in his guest suite, a fact that Xol had been informed of by his chamberlain, who mentioned it in passing, in a tone of voice that suggested it was the kind of detail the Emperor might find interesting. Xol had filed it away and tried not to think about it. He was thinking about it now. "This is the second," he said, stopping before a portrait of a woman with a calm, watchful expression and a jade pendant at her throat. Emperor Yaxol, not because any emperor had ordered it so, but because the original had been commissioned by popular petition 60 years after his death, when the Reform era had produced enough stability that people had time to look back and understand what they were looking back at. It showed him at perhaps 40, older than the small portrait in the guest suite. There were lines at the corners of his eyes. He was wearing the obsidian bracelet. He was looking directly at the painter, or at the viewer, with an expression that Xol had spent his entire life trying to decode. Not severity, not triumph, something more complicated, like someone who had carried something very heavy for a very long time and had made peace with the weight. Darian stood in front of it for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "I read that he almost didn't take the throne." "After the siege," Xol said, "he stood in the throne room and felt nothing, the accounts say. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to feel." "What changed his mind?" "Taya, and Satal, his sister-in-law. She told him he could choose to build instead of destroy. He was never certain he made the right choice. There's a letter, in the Imperial Archive, written late in his reign. He says he still had nightmares. He says he still didn't know if what he built was enough to balance what he destroyed to build it." Darian was quiet. "What do you think?" Xol blinked. "Of standing in this hall every few months and measuring himself against the faces on the wall. And finding the measurement consistently, quietly, devastating." He had been about to answer. He had been, for the first time and longer that he could precisely remember, about to say something true to someone who was not a portrait.
The doors at the far end of the hall opened. The interruption. It was Lord Matson who entered, which told Xol immediately that this was not an accident. Lord Matson was the head of the expansionist faction in the Varek court, a title no one used officially, and everyone understood implicitly. He was 63 years old, had served under 2 Omega emperors, and had survived both by being precisely useful enough to keep and precisely careful enough not to threaten. He believed, with the quiet conviction of a man who had held the belief long enough that it felt like fact, that the Empire's strength came from its willingness to take what it wanted. He had been Iktan's greatest critic and his most effective general, a contradiction he wore without apparent discomfort. He bowed to Xol. He bowed, slightly less deeply, to Darien. He smiled at both of them with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned that smiling was useful. "Your Radiance," he said. "Your Imperial Highness. I apologize for the interruption. There is a matter requiring the Emperor's attention. The Council has convened an emergency session regarding the Northern Grain Assessment. Your Radiance's presence was specifically requested." Xol looked at him. The Northern Grain Assessment had been submitted 2 weeks ago and was not, by any reading of it, an emergency. It was a routine report. It contained no surprises. Xol had read it on the journey back from Tlavik. "Who requested my presence specifically?" Xol asked. "The full council, Your Radiance, unanimously. A full council unanimous request could not be declined without significant political consequence." Lord Matson was aware of this. The slight satisfaction in his eyes, very brief, very controlled, confirmed that this had been considered. Xol held the anger flat and still inside his chest, the way he had learned. He did not look at Darien. He did not want to see what Darien's expression was doing, because whatever it was, understanding or polite neutrality or something else, he thought it might make the anger harder to contain. "Of course," Xol said. "Please convey that I will attend shortly." The council had hoped for immediately, Your Radiance. Another beat. Another flat, still containment. "Then I will attend immediately." He turned to Darien. He had about 4 seconds to say something, and the right something, in front of Lord Matson, who was watching with the attentive interest of a man cataloging everything. "My apologies," Xol said. "I will have my Chancellor arrange a continuation of the tour this afternoon, if Your Imperial Highness is willing." Darien looked at him, not at Lord Matson, not at the hall, at Xol, with a steadiness that Xol felt somewhere behind his sternum. "I'll be here," Darien said. 2 words, simple. And somehow the most stabilizing thing anyone had said to Xol in recent memory. Alone, in the memorial hall, Lord Matson paused at the door. "Your Imperial Highness," he said pleasantly, "if you require anything during the Emperor's absence, please do not hesitate to call upon me. I am always at the disposal of our honored guests." "Thank you," Darien said. "I hope the tour has been informative." A pause, calibrated. Emperor Xol is very devoted to the memorial hall. He visits often. Some in the court feel he visits, perhaps more than is entirely necessary. He let that sit for a moment, smile still in place, then bowed and withdrew. Darien stood in the empty hall and looked at the door. Then he turned back to the portrait of Iktan. He had been in enough courts to know exactly what had just happened. The emergency session that was not an emergency. The unanimous request that gave the Emperor no room to decline politely. The parting comment, seemingly casual, actually a message. Your host is considered excessive, naive, too sentimental for the throne he sits on. A faction of the Varek court was telling him something. Whether they were trying to manage his perception of Xol, or trying to signal that there was internal opposition he could exploit, or simply establishing that they existed and had opinions. Probably all 3 simultaneously, was something he would need to think about carefully. He looked at the portrait. "Is that what yours are about?" He had not intended to ask that. He had intended to ask something more measured, something diplomatic, something that gathered information without revealing that he had already developed, in 3 days, the strong impression that Emperor Xol-Itzan was in some private war with himself that nobody else in his court seemed to have noticed. Or perhaps they had noticed and didn't know what to do with it. Or noticed and found it useful. Darien walked slowly back along the hall, looking at the portraits as he went. Yaxal with her listening eyes. The 3rd emperor, who had expanded the court system to include Omega magistrates. The 4th, who had established the educational academies. Each one building on the last. Each one, the account suggested, marked by the same particular tension. The weight of what Iktan had been, held up against what they themselves were.
200 years of Omega Emperors quietly measuring themselves against a legend. He paused at the small portrait near the entrance, the one he hadn't looked at closely on the way in. A young man, Xol's age, maybe younger. The placard read, Emperor Ohun, third of the line, ruled 11 years, known for his reform of the provincial education system. He looked tired in the portrait. Hopeful, but tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who cared a great deal and was not certain it would be enough. Darian thought about what Xol had said. I think the people who suffered can decide if it was enough. And I think most of them are dead now, so we'll never know. He had expected when he asked the question, a diplomatic answer. An imperial answer. The kind of answer you gave in a formal context when someone asked about your dynasty's complicated history. He had gotten something real instead. It had surprised him. He was still standing alone in a foreign empire's memorial hall, with the afternoon light shifting through the ceiling openings, a little surprised. His own empire was smaller. His own dynastic history was shorter and less dramatic, and in the last few generations, somewhat troubled by drought and the particular economic instability that followed bad harvests. His court wanted this alliance because they needed it. Trade routes, grain surplus, military deterrence. Those were real and pressing. He had wanted those things too. He had come here wanting those things. He was now also, quietly, wanting to know what Xol's nightmares were about. Wanting to finish that conversation. Wanting, and this he examined briefly, acknowledged, and set carefully to one side for later. To understand why someone who was this clearly good at ruling was also this clearly convinced he wasn't. He had told Farouk that the preliminary discussions weren't finished. He had meant it politically. He was now also meaning it in a way that he suspected Lord Savin, Minister Serath, and the entire formal negotiation framework would find deeply inconvenient. He looked at Iktan's portrait one last time. You were trying, he said quietly to the empty room. I think he is too. I don't think he knows that's the same thing. The portrait said nothing. But the afternoon light shifted, warm and gold, and somewhere in the palace a council was probably arguing about grain. And Darian Koresh of the Zafar Concordat stood in a foreign memorial hall and thought about what it meant to measure a person by the wrong thing. He would be here, he had said, when Xol returned.
I hope you are enjoying this story so far. Let me know in the comments below what you've enjoyed in the story so far. Check out the prequel if you haven't listened to it. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
Chapter 3. 2 courts, 1 problem. Darian. The Joint Assembly, 5th day. Darian had attended many assemblies in his life. He had attended them as a child, standing at his father's elbow, absorbing the grammar of power the way children absorb language, through repetition and proximity, without yet knowing what any of it meant. He had attended them as crown prince, performing careful neutrality, while learning which silences were dangerous and which were simply long. He had been attending them as emperor for 5 years now, and he had developed, in that time, a reliable instinct for when a room was about to become a problem. The joint assembly of both imperial courts had been a problem from the moment the doors opened. It was not stated anywhere in the formal agenda. The agenda was elegant, even-handed, a masterpiece of diplomatic language that committed to nothing and offended no one. Trade route frameworks, agricultural knowledge exchange, mutual non-aggression terms. Very reasonable, very carefully worded. The problem was in the seating arrangement, which put Lord Matson and his faction directly across from Minister Serath and Lord Savan, a configuration that Darian suspected had been either a catastrophic oversight or a very deliberate provocation. The problem was in the way Lord Matson had spent the first 20 minutes of preliminary discussion smiling at the Zafari delegation with the specific warmth of a man who wanted them to know he was doing them a favor by being pleasant. The problem was in the proposal that Lord Matson's faction had submitted that morning, which Darian had read in full, twice, before the assembly began, and which was dressed in the language of partnership, and structured, if you read it carefully, as annexation. He had not said anything about it to Farouk. He had folded it, tucked it into his formal satchel, and walked into the assembly hall with his face arranged in the pleasant, attentive expression he used when he was thinking very hard about something he was not yet ready to address. Now he sat at the long assembly table and watched. Lord Matson had been speaking for 7 minutes. He was very good at it. The kind of speaker who seemed reasonable, who cited historical precedent and economic practicality and the mutual benefit of both empires, who used the word partnership so often it began to lose meaning. The Zafari ministers beside Darien were nodding. Farouk, to his credit, was not. Darien was watching Xol. Xol sat at the head of the Varric side of the table, which was correct and appropriate, and he was listening to Lord Matson with the same patient attention he gave to everything. His hands were folded on the table. His expression was composed. He had been composed since the assembly began, and the composure had the particular quality of something being held carefully in place, rather than something that came naturally. Darien recognized it because he had worn it himself, many times. The face you put on when someone in your court was doing something you found intolerable, and you had not yet decided exactly how to respond. Lord Matson reached the conclusion of his proposal and looked around the table with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he had just said something irrefutable. The terms as outlined, he said, represent the most efficient path to stability for both nations. The Varric Empire's administrative experience, combined with the Zafar Concordat's natural resources and geographic position, creates an alignment that benefits. No. One word. Quiet. Absolute. The table went still. Xol had not raised his voice. He had not shifted his posture. His hands were still folded on the table. He looked at Lord Matson with an expression that was entirely calm, and, Darien realized with a clarity that hit him somewhere behind the ribs, entirely immovable. Your Radiance, Lord Matson said, recovering smoothly, if there are specific terms you'd like to revisit. The terms as outlined are not terms, Xol said. His voice was the same quiet. Not cold exactly, more like water. It would find every crack and fill it without hurry. They are a transfer of administrative authority, dressed in the language of mutual benefit. The Zafar Concordat is not a province of this empire. It will not become one. That is not what was proposed by either party when this summit was arranged, and it is not what I will authorize. Silence. Genuine silence, the kind that meant everyone in the room was recalibrating. With respect, Your Radiance, Lord Matson said, and there was something different in his voice now, still smooth, but with an edge underneath, like something had been decided. The Empire has traditionally expanded through decisive action. It is how we have maintained our strength. Emperor Iktan himself. Emperor Iktan, Xol said, and still quiet, still that same absolute calm, made his last vow to the people from a public square in plain clothing. He said he would be the last emperor to rule through fear. A beat. I have read that speech more times than I can count. I suggest you read it again. Lord Matson closed his mouth. It was, Darien thought, the most elegant thing he had ever witnessed in an assembly chamber. No performance, no theatrics, just a man who knew exactly where he stood and was entirely uninterested in moving. He became aware that he was staring, and that Farouk, immediately to his left, had noticed. He arranged his expression back into diplomacy and said nothing. Xol turned to the Zafari side of the table for the first time since the assembly began. His eyes found Darien's with the directness of someone who had decided something. What was proposed when this summit was arranged, he said, was an alliance between two sovereign nations. That is what I intend to negotiate. If your Imperial Highness is still willing. I am, Darien said. He said it the same way he'd said, I'll be here. Meaning it completely. Something shifted in Xol's face. Very brief, very small. There and gone. But Darien had been watching, and he caught it. The assembly continued. Lord Matson was quiet for the remainder of it. Xol. After the assembly ended at the 4th hour past midday, and Xol went directly from the chamber to his chancellor's offices, where he sat in a chair, accepted a cup of something hot, and did not speak for approximately 3 minutes. Chancellor Oren, who had been his chancellor for 11 years and understood silence the way some people understood music, did not speak either. He refilled the cup when it was empty. He set a bowl of fruit on the table. He waited. Lord Matson will move against me in the autumn session, Xol said finally. Yes, Oren said, almost certainly. He'll frame it as the emperor prioritizing foreign sentiment over imperial interest. He'll have some support for that framing. I know. Xol looked at the fruit bowl. He was not hungry. Did I do the right thing? Oren considered this with the seriousness he gave every genuine question, which was one of the reasons Xol had kept him for 11 years. You did the thing that was true, Oren said. Whether it was right will depend on what happens next. But I think, for what it's worth, that you could not have done otherwise and still been you. Xol thought about that.
Ikton would have handled it better, he said. Not self-pity, just habit. The comparison was so old it was almost automatic. Oren made a sound that in a less formal man would have been a snort. Ikton, he said, would have had Lord Matson quietly poisoned 6 months ago, and then felt complicated about it for the rest of his reign. You told him to read a speech. I think on balance, your version is better. Xol stared at him. Oren looked back with perfect equanimity. After a moment, Xol laughed. Real surprise, the kind that came from somewhere that hadn't been reached in a while. It lasted only a moment, but it was genuine. Go home, Oren, he said. You've done enough for today. I intend to. Oren rose, straightened his robes, and paused at the door. The Zafari Emperor asked his attendant this afternoon if there was anything the Emperor might need. His attendant passed the inquiry to mine. I told them you were well. Xol kept his expression even. Thank you, Oren. Good night, Your Radiance. He left. Xol sat alone in the Chancellor's office with the empty cup and the untouched fruit, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing, the true thing, the thing he could not have done otherwise and still been himself. And that it would cost him, and that the cost was worth it, and that none of this made the next 6 months any less exhausting to contemplate. He stayed until the lamps needed refilling. Then he went to his chambers, lay in the dark, and did not sleep. Sometime past midnight, the east corridor on the 3rd residential level connected the Imperial wing to the guest quarters, and was not, at the 2nd hour past midnight, supposed to contain anyone. Xol had taken it because it was the long way to the library, and he had run out of things to think at his ceiling. He had not brought attendants. He had put on a plain robe over his sleeping clothes, taken a lamp, and left, because sometimes a problem could be walked out of you if you gave it enough hallway. He had been walking for perhaps 10 minutes when he saw the other light. It came from around the corner at the corridor's midpoint, a steady lamp glow, moving slowly, the particular pace of someone who was not going anywhere specific. Xol slowed. The light rounded the corner and resolved into Darian Korash, in a plain traveling robe, lamp in one hand, looking exactly like a man who had also run out of things to think, at his ceiling. They both stopped, a moment of complete stillness, 2 lamps illuminating a shared circle of warm light in the dark corridor. Both of them slightly disheveled in the specific way of people who had not intended to be seen. Your Radiance, Darian said. Your Imperial Highness, Xol said. A pause. The library is that direction, Xol said, gesturing. If that's where you're going. I wasn't going anywhere, Darian said. I was walking. So was I. Another pause. Shorter. The garden at the end of this corridor has a good view of the city at night. Xol said, if you want to walk somewhere. Darian looked at him. Lead the way. The garden was small, one of a dozen tucked between the residential wings, more functional than ceremonial, with stone benches and climbing plants, and a low wall that looked out over the city below. The city at night was a scatter of lights against dark, warm and alive in a way that Xol felt easier to think around than silence. They stood at the wall for a while without speaking. It was not uncomfortable. This surprised Xol less than it probably should have. You didn't eat at dinner, Darian said eventually. Xol looked at him. You noticed that. I notice things, he said it simply, without apology. It's useful, usually. I wasn't hungry. Lord Matson will move against you, Darian said. Not a question. Yes, you knew that before you spoke. Darian was quiet for a moment. Then, in the Concordat, my court calls what I did this morning, when I pushed the timeline, arrived early, disrupted the schedule. They call it impulsive. Lord Savan has used the word reckless twice in formal correspondence. What do you call it? Xol asked. Knowing when the moment is right and not waiting for permission. My father used to say that an emperor who moves only when his court agrees will always move too late. My court says I move in the wrong direction. Too much travel. Not enough. He searched for the diplomatic word and gave up on it. Ruthlessness. They want more ruthlessness. Then, more quietly. I used to think that was a failing. The city lights moved below them, a lamp in a window, someone awake and unknowing. Xol watched it and felt the thing he always felt here. The weight of all of them, all the people, all the ordinary, specific lives that were in some partial way his responsibility. It was not a comfortable feeling. He had never found a way to make it comfortable. He had stopped trying. In the assembly today, Darian said, and his voice had shifted, quieter now, less diplomatic. When you said no, just that, just no, I thought, That is not a man who lacks what his court wants him to have. That is a man who has decided what it costs and is paying it anyway. Xol went very still. Your ancestor freed people, Darian continued. You're trying not to conquer them. That sounds like the same instinct to me. The words landed somewhere Xol had not known was open. He felt it. A loosening, slight and sudden, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long, he'd stopped noticing the pressure until it eased. His throat tightened with something he hadn't been expecting, and did not have a name ready for. He did not realize, until the warmth reached him, that Darian had moved closer. Not a dramatic movement. Not even a conscious one, probably. Just a few inches, the natural drift of someone whose attention had gathered itself into a single point. But the distance between them had changed, and the air had changed with it, and Xol's omega instincts, which had been very carefully redirected for a very long time, chose this moment to stop cooperating entirely. It was not loud. It was not a wave or a crash, or any of the dramatic language the old texts used. It was quieter than that. More like recognition, like something that had been slightly wrong for years, had briefly, unexpectedly, been set right. His breath came out unsteadily. Darian went very still beside him. The stillness had a quality to it. Not withdrawal, not discomfort. More like someone who had just noticed they were standing at the edge of something significant, and was making a conscious, effortful choice not to step forward without permission. Xol could feel it, the effort of it, the restraint. He could feel, with a clarity that was almost embarrassing, that it was costing Darian something. Xol, Darian said. His voice was very careful. He had dropped the title. He might not have noticed he'd done it. Tell me if you need me to step back. Xol turned to look at him. Darian was watching him with an expression that was entirely open in a way that powerful people almost never allowed themselves to be. Not performing restraint. Actually restraining. Actually waiting, with the full weight of his alpha instincts running in the opposite direction, because he had decided that what Xol needed mattered more than what he wanted. Xol had not been looked at like that before. He did not have a protocol for it. No, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. Don't step back. Something in Darian's expression shifted. A release of held tension, very slight, like a man who had been braced and could finally unbrace. He did not move closer. He did not reach out. He just stood there, at the new distance, and let that be enough for now. And it was. It was in a way that Xol could not have explained, and did not try to, exactly enough. They stayed like that for a while. The city moved below them. Someone's lamp went out. Someone else's lit. In my empire, Darian said eventually, his voice back to its usual register, almost. When I told my court I was refusing to take consorts until I found my fated pair, Lord Savan called it sentimental. He said it was a children's story. What did you tell him? I told him I had read the historical accounts, and the evidence for fated pairs was better than the evidence for most things Lord Savan believes. A pause. He didn't find that comforting. Xol laughed. Small. Real. No, I imagine not. I also told him, Darian said, that I would know when I found them, that I would feel it as a recognition. His voice was even, careful, deliberate in the way of someone choosing to say something true and accepting the consequences of it. I told him I would know because it would feel like something slightly wrong being set right. The silence that followed was not empty. Xol looked out at the city. He could feel his own heartbeat. He was not going to say anything yet. There were 100 things to navigate, 2 courts and 2 empires, and the morning that would come with all its requirements. But he was also, for the first time in a very long time, not running from a feeling. He was just standing next to it, letting it be there. You should eat tomorrow, Darian said. Quiet, practical, an offering of normalcy over the charged air. Proper meals. You can't manage 2 courts on nothing. That's very sound governance advice, Xol said. I'm full of it. Your ministers seem to disagree. My ministers, Darian said with the serenity of someone who had made peace with a fact, are going to have a very difficult autumn. Xol turned to look at him, the question in it. Darian met his eyes. I came here for an alliance, he said. I intend to have one, the kind that means something, whatever that costs. Not a declaration, not yet, but something. Enough. We should sleep, Xol said, when the lamp oil had burned low and the night had deepened around them. Probably, Darian agreed. He did not move immediately. Then, good night, Xol. Still no title. Still, Xol thought, not noticing, or noticing and choosing. Chapter 4. Something Worth Building. XOL. Before dawn. 8th day. He went to the memorial hall alone, which was not unusual. He went before the staff arrived, before the city below had fully woken, when the light through the ceiling openings was still blue and thin, and the portraits held their expressions in near darkness. This was, he had discovered sometime in his 20s, the best time to think. No one to perform for. No weight of being watched. He stood in front of Iktan's portrait for a long time. Today was the day. The alliance terms, the real ones, the sovereign ones, the kind that Xol had meant when he had said no in the assembly, and meant it, had been drafted through 3 days of genuine negotiation that had been exhausting and contentious, and in the end, good. Fair. The kind of agreement that asked something of both sides and gave something real to both sides. Chancellor Oren had called it workable. Farouk had called it acceptable. Lord Savan had called it a disappointment, and Lord Matson had said nothing at all, which was louder. Today, both courts would witness the formal signing. Today, the thing would become real. And after that, Darian had not said it in words, but Xol had felt the shape of it in the corridor, in the days since, in the careful way they navigated each other in public, while something between them settled into a new configuration, patient and certain. After that, something else would also become real. He looked at the portrait. He had stood here so many times, measuring, comparing, finding the distance between what Iktan had been and what Xol was, and concluding always that the distance was considerable and the direction was wrong. He tried it now, one more time, out of habit, and something was different. Not the portrait. The portrait was the same. The obsidian bracelet, the deep blue tunic, the eyes that looked at something beyond the frame, with an expression Savan had spent his life trying to decode. But the thing Savan had always read there, the iron certainty, the unreachable standard, the silent verdict of not enough, was not there this morning. Or perhaps it had never been there. Perhaps he had put it there himself, the way you could stare at a word until it stopped meaning anything and started meaning whatever your fear needed it to mean. What he saw this morning, in the thin blue light, was someone who had been 23 years old and completely terrified, and had stood on a platform in a public square in plain clothing and told the truth anyway. Someone who had nightmares for the rest of his life and kept building in spite of them. Someone who had not known, standing in the empty throne room, if what he was trying to do would be enough. Who had chosen to try anyway. Who had written, late in his reign, in a private letter that was never meant to be read. And try again, until you build something worth leaving behind. Savan had read that letter so many times he could recite it. He had never, until this moment, understood that it was not a verdict. It was an instruction. It was Iktan, 200 years across time, saying, "This is what I did. This is what you do. You keep going. You build what you can with what you are. You do not wait until you are certain you are enough, because that day does not come, and the building cannot wait." He was not Iktan. He was never going to be Iktan. He was the thing Iktan had been trying to make possible. An emperor who did not have to be ruthless to be strong. An empire that did not have to take what it wanted, because it had learned slowly, across 200 years and 6 Omega emperors, and an enormous amount of difficult work, how to build instead. He was not the shadow of the legacy. He was what the legacy had been for. Saul stood in the blue morning light and felt something settle in his chest that had never settled before. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, finally, like water finding its level. He was going to be all right. He was already, in the ways that mattered, all right. He inclined his head to the portrait. Not a bow, not deference, but the acknowledgement you gave to someone who had handed you something valuable, and walked back toward the light. The signing. The council chamber. Midday. The formal signing of the Varric-Zafar Alliance Accord took place in the great council chamber with both courts assembled, which meant approximately 60 people, arranged in careful hierarchical order, around a room that had hosted more contentious events than this, and would host more contentious events again. The terms were read aloud in both languages. This took time. Saul stood through it with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the middle distance, and did not let his eyes drift to Darian more than twice, which he counted as a personal achievement. The terms were, as Oren had said, workable. The trade routes opened. The agricultural knowledge exchange formalized. The grain surplus that Zafar's southern provinces needed, arranged through fair trade rather than extraction. A mutual recognition of sovereignty that named both empires as equals in the accord, which had caused Lord Matson to go briefly but visibly rigid when the draft was first circulated, and had caused Darian's Farouk to make a sound that Saul was fairly certain was a suppressed expression of relief. What the terms did not include, any clause of administrative transfer,
Any provision that could be read, in good faith or bad, as one empire absorbing the other. Any language that was not at its core, two sovereign nations choosing to build something together. Lord Savan had called it a disappointment on his side. Lord Matson had called it insufficient on his. Xol had noted that when two opposing factions were equally unhappy with an agreement, the agreement was probably fair. The reading concluded. The official seals were brought forward. Xol signed first, because it was his empire and his chamber.
He pressed the imperial seal into the clay. With a steady pressure Orin had taught him when he was 14 years old, learning the physical grammar of authority. He handed the stylus across the table. Darien took it. Their fingers did not touch. They were in a formal assembly with 60 witnesses, and there was no reason for their fingers to touch. But there was a moment, a half second, neither of them moving, before Darien accepted the stylus, in which something passed between them that had nothing to do with trade routes. Darien signed. The herald announced the accord sealed. Both courts acknowledged with the formal responses of their respective traditions. Chancellor Orin looked like a man who'd been holding his breath for 8 days and had finally been permitted to exhale. Farouk, across the room, had the carefully neutral expression of a man who was going to have a great deal of correspondence to manage for the next several months, and was already drafting it in his head. And then the formalities ended, and the chamber began the slow, organized dissolution of a large gathering. Nobles and ministers turning to each other in clusters, the low noise of political assessment beginning to fill the room. Darien did not turn to his ministers. He looked at Xol across the table, in front of both courts, in front of Lord Matson and Lord Savin and Farouk and Orin and everyone who had opinions about what this summit should have produced and what it had actually produced. And he said clearly enough to be heard by the people nearest them, in the common trade tongue that both courts shared. Your Radiance, I would like to formally request continued discussions, beyond the scope of the accord. At your convenience. For as long as you'll have them. Not a diplomatic request, or not only. The phrasing was careful, technically within the bounds of formal language, technically about the alliance, and also not, at all, only about the alliance, and everyone in earshot who had been paying attention for the last 8 days understood this completely. The room did not erupt. It was too formal for erupting. But Xol felt the attention of 60 people sharpening at once, the particular quality of a room in which something significant had just happened, and everyone was deciding what to do with it. He looked at Darien. Darien looked back. Patient, steady, the full weight of what he'd just said accepted and held without apology. Xol thought about the corridor at midnight, the city lights below, something slightly wrong being set right. He thought about the portrait in the blue morning light, and what he had finally understood. The discussion, Xol said, and his voice was even, and the room was very quiet, are ongoing. I see no reason they should conclude. Simple, understated, witnessed, enough. The same small deliberate motion from the corridor. Not an emperor's bow, but something more personal, more specific. An acknowledgement between two people who had figured out something true about each other in 8 days, and were choosing, in front of 60 witnesses, not to pretend otherwise. Lord Savin, Xol noted from the corner of his eye, had the expression of a man revising several internal documents simultaneously. Lord Matson had gone very still, in the way of someone deciding which war to fight next. Orin, directly to Xol's left, was looking at the middle distance with the determinedly neutral expression of a chancellor who was professionally obligated not to look pleased and was finding this challenging. Xol kept his own face composed and thought, good, after. The garden, late afternoon. The small garden off the east corridor was theirs by accident and then by habit. No one had designated it. No attendant had arranged it. It had simply become, over 8 days, the place they ended up. The afternoon light was long and gold. The city below was doing what cities did, being alive, being ordinary, being the accumulated weight of thousands of specific people, making their way through their specific days. Darien sat on the stone bench. Xol sat beside him, close enough that the distance between them was no longer a question either of them was asking. Lord Savin, Darien said, would like me to know that I have created a diplomatic situation. Lord Matson, Xol said, would like me to know the same thing. How many letters do you think they'll send each other? Before or after they realize they have the same complaint. Darien made a sound that was definitely a laugh, low and genuine. They're going to have a very confusing autumn. They are, Xol agreed. He felt something ease through him as he said it. Not dismissiveness, not the performance of unconcern. Actual ease.
The problems were real. Lord Matson would move against him in the autumn session, and it would be difficult, and it would require everything Xol had to navigate it. The alliance would face resistance from both sides. There would be years of careful work ahead, the kind that didn't look like anything from the outside and cost everything from the inside. He knew all of that. He also knew, sitting in the long gold light with the city below them and Darian beside him, that he was going to do it anyway, that he had been doing it all along. That this, the building, the trying, the stubborn, gentle insistence on a better way, was what he was for. I went to the memorial hall this morning, he said. Before dawn. I know, Darian said. I saw you go. I was also not sleeping. Xol glanced at him. Were you watching my corridor? I was walking past your corridor, Darian said, with great dignity. There is a distinction. There is a small distinction. Xol looked at him for a moment. Darian looked back with the expression of a man prepared to defend his position indefinitely. Xol felt something warm and helpless rise in his chest that was also, he realized, entirely unthreatening. It did not need to be redirected. It did not need to be managed, or suppressed, or converted into 18-hour workdays. It was just there. Easy as breathing. I understood something, he said. This morning, looking at the portrait. Darian waited, still doing the thing where he listened with his whole attention. I have been trying to be what he was, Xol said. I have been standing in that hall my entire reign, measuring the distance between us, and concluding that I was failing. And I think, he paused, finding the words, the real ones, the ones that had settled into place in the blue morning light. I think he was not trying to make more of himself. He was trying to make something that didn't need to be him. He was trying to build a world where an emperor could be what I am. And then I spent my whole life thinking what I am wasn't enough. The city moved below them. It's enough, Darian said. Quiet, certain. Not reassurance. Statement. It was enough before I got here. It will be enough after the autumn session, and the one after that. You were already the thing he was trying to make room for. Xol breathed in, breathed out. I know, he said. And he did, for the first time, fully, without the habitual argument rising up to challenge it. He did. They sat in the gold light and the city moved below them, and the empire stretched out in every direction, 200 years of building laid out across the landscape, imperfect and ongoing, and worth continuing. Somewhere in it, children were learning to read in the academies Xol-Itzan had founded. Trade routes were carrying grain to places that had been hungry. A council that was half elected was arguing about something, which meant it was working. And here, in a small garden off the east corridor, two emperors sat close enough that the question of distance had become irrelevant, watching the afternoon turn toward evening, and not being in any hurry at all. What happens now, Xol said, politically? Walk me through it. Now, Darian said, settling into it with the ease of someone who had been thinking about this. We survived the autumn session. Both of us. I go home, manage Savin, present the accord terms to the full Concordat Assembly, and make the case for the thing I already know is right. You hold the line against Matson and let the alliance produce visible results before the winter. In the spring? Darian glanced at him. In the spring I will have grounds for an official return visit. Ongoing discussions as the accord specifies. The accord does not specify a timeline. No, but I am specifying one. Xol looked at him. Spring, he said. Spring, Darian confirmed. Not a question. Not a negotiation. A thing decided. The way the things that mattered got decided. With the understanding that it was going to hold. The sun moved. The shadows stretched long across the garden. A bird somewhere in the climbing plants made a brief satisfied sound and was quiet again. You know, Xol said, when Orin told me a foreign emperor wanted to schedule a summit, he said I would find it complicated. He was right. He often is. He also said I might find it useful. He did not say, useful, Darian said, with an expression of mild offense, is a very small word for what I am. Xol turned to look at him fully. Darian was watching him with that expression. Open, warm, the one that had been quietly dismantling Xol's careful internal architecture for 8 days without apology. And for once Xol did not look away from it, or file it somewhere to deal with later. He let it land. Yes, he said. It is. Darian's mouth curved, not the diplomatic smile, not the careful public expression. The real one, the one Xol had first seen in the throne room, when Xol had brought up citrus trade routes with earnest, helpless specificity, and Darian had leaned in instead of away. Spring, Xol said again. An agreement. A beginning. Spring, Darian said. Below them, the city of the Varic Empire moved through its evening. Ordinary and alive and ongoing.
200 years of difficult trying, made into something that worked. Above them, the first stars were arriving, faint and certain. The same stars that had looked down on Ikton standing on a platform, in plain clothing and telling the truth. And on Yaxal listening until the room ran out of words. And on every emperor who had stood in this place and tried to build something worth leaving behind. Xol sat in a long gold light and felt, for the first time, that he was one of them. Not their shadow, their continuation. He was going to be all right.
Quote of the week: try, fail, and try again until you build something worth leaving behind. Inspired by Samuel Beckett. Thank you for listening to The Weight of Jade, a sequel to the Omega Who Conquered an Empire. Hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to hear more, please like, subscribe, and comment. New stories uploaded every Friday.